Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar as we discuss hidden Microsoft 365 security gaps for state and local governments. My name is Miranda Knutson. I'll be moderating this webinar behind the scenes today. This webinar is recorded. The recording will be available later this afternoon, which you'll receive an email for once it's ready. Please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate. Type them into the Q&A bar. All questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, I'm happy to pass it off to our speaker, Michael Smith, to begin.
Thank you, Miranda, and welcome everyone to our topic today, Hidden Microsoft 365 Security Gaps, Putting State and Local Governments at Risk. I am Michael Smith, one of our solution engineers here at CoreView, and I will be walking you through our content today. Again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to type those in and we will address the questions at the end of the webinar. So the hidden 365 security gaps. Let's begin. So hidden resilience gaps in Microsoft 365. What are those and why are those? I kind of do the why game and the what game. So why are we concerned with resilience gaps in Microsoft 365? Well, one, Microsoft is now becoming more mission critical for many state and local governments with their applications. We've pretty much standardized on using Microsoft 365 as our identity access management platform. And so because of that, it's a much more critical application in the overall IT infrastructure. If you guys as admins and IT executives were to poll your end users, your constituents, the users of 365, if you were to poll them, what do they think are the security risks or the cybersecurity risks related to access within 365? Many of them will probably note the two that you see here, phishing and malware. But you guys know, like I do, or we should know, that many of the risks are well beyond just a phishing attack or a malware attack at the, let's say, endpoint level. Because of our administrative role, we spend a lot of time on the back end, confirming and validating that we put in the right configurations to prevent misconfigurations of the environment, to prevent the bad actors from getting in, as well as to prevent data exfiltration that should not go out. So again, because of the platform, the risks are more than just the standard phishing and malware. And then of course, they begin with the access as far as the bad actors. Again, the resilience gap also is the access point, the misconfiguration of those configurations, as well as a lack of the physical control of those configurations. So let's talk about the unnoticed M365 risks. Some of this may be common sense to some of us in the IT world. Some of this may not be. Number one, let's start with the privileged access sprawl. What do we mean by that? Well, again, let's make the assumption that everyone here on this call is an admin in some capacity in Microsoft 365. Well, the first question is, yes, we have privileged access, meaning we have some type of administrative role. But now the next question is, what role do we have? Are we physically overprivileged for the role that we play today? Or what task do I need to perform right here, right now? How many of us are in the organization that have similar roles? Again, back to the access sprawl. The next part of that is, do I have just-in-time admin roles or access? Or do I have permanent access? And I'm pretty sure there have been instances where someone has put in a request to get access, and somehow, some way, we're not blaming or judging anyone, that access retained for a lot longer period of time than necessary. The third bullet point that I really want to address here that a lot of times is actually an unnoticed risk is what we call configuration drift. No, we're not talking about the Fast and the Furious and the drifting aspect of the cars. We're talking about the drifting of your configurations. Again, think about how, again, we're preventing access into the environment. We're controlling how users interact with the environment. Certain policies like Teams policies, similar to this meeting, where we're only allowing you to be able to type in the Q&A versus having audio and video. Those are custom settings within your environment. However, a lot of times we in IT sometimes think that once we create that configuration, that policy, that rule, that it's a set it and forget it scenario. Many times it's not. Again, back to the first bullet point, privileged access sprawl. How many of us have multiple admins in our organization? Well, who created or modified that configuration previously? When do we know? How do we detect if that configuration has been modified or tampered with, which we call configuration drift? We need to know when these configurations change. So again, configuration drift is a huge area or a huge gap within the 365 risk vector. Application over permissioning. Well, of course, as we have 365, again, we talked about it being the standard identity access management platform. But now, of course, in the world of apps, we need to add additional apps for functionality within 365. Things like Adobe, DocuSign, calendars functionality through, let's say, Monday.com, project management applications. The question would be, of those applications, do we have a way to monitor and know exactly what the permissions are for those applications? Are they over permissioned, if you will? Because a part of the access point or the gap is to be able to understand should the applications have the proper permissions or which ones are over permissioned. And then, of course, now that we understand who has access, or maybe we don't, because again of the access sprawl, we know the configurations are out there, but of course, who configured it? How are they configured? I'm pretty sure everyone here on the call, having been an admin of 365, can understand going into a configuration. And if you think about the UI in Microsoft, you may start in one place. It gives you a pop-up and you have to click configure another pop-up, a third pop-up, a fourth pop-up. But now, based on all of those configurations, could you turn around and say, if I had to rebuild that particular configuration again, would I remember all of those configuration parameters verbatim? Last bullet point goes into that scenario. Limited tenant level restore readiness. Are we ready to restore any of these configurations right here, right now, without a lot of back and forth to confirm or configure this properly? These are the unnoticed 365 risks that we're talking about today. Of course, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a why guy. So why does this matter? Well, again, size will matter in this context. In large government environments, security incidents often start with, we just spoke about overprivileged accounts, an admin account without MFA. I'll start with this one just because the paradigm has shifted. We know in the beginning, the actual access point at the admin level was let's make sure that all of our users, including admins, had MFA. In Microsoft, that started at the per user level. Well, Microsoft is deprecating that functionality, and probably for the past year and a half or 2 years, everyone has shifted to using conditional access policies to ensure that. Yes, some of you guys may also have third-party solutions that also govern that scenario. And I was speaking with a customer about 3 weeks ago, and as we were doing what we call a health check, and we noted that they had many admins in their environment. And so their caveat to me was, oh, well, we use third-party company name. And because of that, then that's how we're governed. Well, what if that application is offline for whatever reason, goes down? Well, now do you have a fallback to secure those admin accounts? Well, they did not based off of the way that they were configured in Microsoft. So again, why does that matter? Is because first and foremost, the bad actors will attack an admin account without MFA. When and if they get in, then the next thing is that they will turn around and look for those applications. We just spoke about over permissioned applications. Once they have access to the applications, they will turn around and proliferate into the environment. So temporary elevated access that was never revoked is also another aspect of that. Again, we understand that many people use a PIM process, privileged identity management access point of only granting access for a period of time, but that's not foolproof if it's not configured properly. And so again, back to the first bullet point, that temporary elevated access sometimes become permanent thus the bad actors can get in. And now we don't really know who is actually performing the actions because we will think that that user account should not have admin roles. So it does matter. Continuing on of the why does it matter, once those privileged access points are compromised, what do the bad actors do? Well, what you'll notice here is nothing about deletion or removal. That is very, say, open-ended. It's quick to note that something doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of like playing those games. Can you compare two different things in a crowded room? Well, they changed your configuration settings. Again, back to the configuration drift. Can we monitor or can you monitor those changes? So the bad actors will change the configuration settings, not necessarily delete or remove, because that again is too aware of what's happening. Next, they establish persistence. They want to get in and they want to stay in. So again, a part of that configuration security change is to also try and see if they can stay in the environment as long as they possibly can without getting timed out. Once they have access to the environment, they proliferate those applications, change the security settings, then they start moving within the environment, accessing different services such as Teams. I just used a Teams example earlier because they know, remember the end user poll, well, how do you think people get in as far as a risk? Phishing alerts or attacks, if you will, malware. Well, now they're going to move into those different applications, barriers to entry for the end users. Teams applications, Exchange applications. And so again, they want to turn around and see where can we either attack the end user or exfiltrate data within the application scope. And then of course, reduce visibility before detection. Again, changing those security settings, they want to turn around and mitigate their footprint so that no one has an easy trail of who actually was performing the actions, as well as how long, back to the persistence note, of how long were they actually in the environment performing the changes. Additional risks that lead to administrative and configuration compromise. The larger blast radius. So again, distributed departments or agencies. I know, having worked with a few state and local government company customers myself, we can't control, you can't control how large that blast radius is. We have to deal with what we know. So that could be many different departments that have to have their own segmentation of control and administration, state agencies, different departments. So that's going to increase the blast radius. Once we now know that we have many of those, do you have a centralized IT staff or administration point, or is it individualized? Again, maybe every agency needs to have their own administrative staff. And again, increasing the blast radius. Less is more is kind of the mantra here, least privileged access. But unfortunately, sometimes we have to deal with the larger blast radius because of the legacy aspect of the environment. Speaking of legacy, the blast radius increases when we talk about not just the cloud environment, but legacy applications, legacy environments, including the hybrid environment. Can we perform the same actions or control and mitigate the same actions both on-prem and in the cloud? Well, again, historically, we know the configuration settings will be totally different from the on-prem environment than for the cloud environment. Do you have to maintain, let's say, legacy applications, which may actually have lesser security protocols and configuration settings? Again, a larger blast radius that you have to now manage and monitor. And then, of course, as we talk about this distributed model, multiple departments slash agencies, multiple teams of administrators out there in the organization, how can we now audit and put ourselves in a better compliance aspect of things, again, from an organizational perspective? That becomes a bigger challenge from an administrative perspective as well as the configuration perspective. But now that we've kind of spoken about some of these, again, elephants in the room, some of this, again, may be new, but I think most of us probably understand this, again, just to solidify that we're all speaking the same language here. But where I want to kind of deviate is what we think is the norm today. So, of those configuration risks, note now we're going to talk about the backup and the restore perspective. I alluded to that previously about being able to be tenant ready to restore any of those configurations. Well, a backup alone will not protect you in 365. But what do we mean by a backup? So, of course, a webinar would not be good if we didn't actually have numbers and percentages. But let's kind of identify, and again, let's be on the same page on how we're talking about the environment here. So a quick analogy that we're talking about here is the glass and water scenario. I used the term barrier to entry previously. Well, the water in this scenario is your content, your data, your email, your files, your teams, your groups, your users, things of that nature. The glass, the configuration to your tenant. Your glass protects the barrier to entry, but it also protects your egress, exfiltration of the data. Because again, you're going to put rules in place. Your purview policies, your labels. Can people download the content? How long should you retain your content? All of those configuration settings, your exchange, export, transport rules, your defender policies and settings, your glass configurations to protect your data, your water. What we don't want is the bad actors to get in and now cause cracks or havoc within the environment. Of course, depending upon the admin role that they get, I don't want to name the medical supply company, but if you think about what happened recently in the news, they were compromised. And based on that compromisation, it was to a particular application, Intune. And so while the glass may not be completely shattered, there is exfiltration of the data or disruption within the organization. It may not always be data, it could be downtime, it could be disruption. And so now that the glass has been fractured, there is data loss or again, disruption from the organization. What we want to prevent is total loss of data, if you will, or loss of the environment by protecting those configurations, thus protecting the glass, your 365 environment. So you'll kind of see a little bit of a thing when we talk about the glass and the water in that scenario. Again, back to the backup, because when we talk about the backup, we pulled a survey of data about a year and a half ago, but the results are still pretty outstanding. So when we talk about the backup, 96% of the respondents actually stated that yes, they have a method for backing up 365. But notice the key term here, data, backing up the water. That same question was posed when it came down to the configurations. Only 18% of those respondents have their configurations being backed up. Pretty significant number from what we consider to be security and the barrier of entry. Why are these numbers important? Because there are lots of assumptions that those end users actually thought about when they took that particular poll. 49% of those believe that Microsoft themselves are backing up their configurations. I'm pretty sure many of you on this call hopefully are aware of that. If not, that is true. Microsoft themselves do not back up your configurations by default. Again, configuration drift will become a play here in this conversation. Continuing on, 23% of those respondents actually believe that the data backup vendors, we're not picking on anyone, but I'm pretty sure most of you have a backup provider to back up your data. They thought that those backup vendors for those data backups were being covered for the configurations. Many of those backup vendors are not supporting configurations. They may support some of the configurations, but again, how deep down the rabbit hole do they go? You actually need to question that, ask that question to your actual backup vendors, because again, state readiness to be able to recover actually will become a big factor if you only have 25% of your configurations in a stable backup manner. Continuing on, 18% of those respondents basically do a backup internally. Again, no issue, no problem. As long as they have a method to back up those configurations, they're in good state. But again, they're doing it in an internal process outside of their backup vendors. and 13% are currently not doing anything to back up those configurations. And again, we're just wanting to put some numbers to the reality of how people look at configurations and backing up those configurations. Again, a few more numbers here, because who really cares? Well, I use the example of the bad actors getting in and proliferating through the environment and getting to the different services. Again, let's think about those services. We have the end user services, Teams, SharePoint, 365 groups, if you will, Exchange. But now, of those services, again, there's still more. The things that we care about: Defender, Intune, Purview. It goes on and on. Well, now, how many configurations are within each one of those services? If you go to Teams right now, you may say it's one service, but how many different policies come natively out of the box? And then how many parameters per configuration or policy or rule? And those are just out of the box. What about those that you guys create your own for your organizations? Now we add to that. Then, of course, how many tenants do you guys have to manage? Yes, many of us may say, well, we only have one tenant. Maybe that's one production tenant. Do you have a prod environment, a test environment, or maybe you have multiple production environments for different reasons? Now you multiply each and every one of those services and each configuration, it actually stacks up and it does matter because, again, it just increases your blast radius for compromise once again. So based on these stats and statistics and everything like that, I kind of want to give you some information from the industry experts. Don't hear it directly from CoreView. I want you to hear it from the industry. I won't go through each and every one of these. I will highlight a few. So for an example, at the top, number one, configuration drift is rated as the number one cloud security threat in H1 of 2025 by Cybersecurity HQ. A few from Microsoft. In a single month, Microsoft reported 176,000 instances of configuration tampering. That was again over a year ago. Think about how that number has most likely increased as time goes on. And again, that's within a single month. Sophos X Ops, again, configuration tampering across the Defender platform. Picus, the impaired defense is rated as the number one MITRE attack surface, if you will. Again, Microsoft ransomware is 40% more effective when Entra is misconfigured. Again, misconfigured. And then, of course, device compromise, 70% when Intune is misconfigured. Do you know how many of your devices are not compliant with your compliance policies or are out of encryption state? Again, it's actually eye-opening to know that information. My point about this particular slide about this is because we know, the bad actors know, that you don't know how to monitor those changes. Notice the theme here. No matter who the actual entity is, Picus, Sophos, XOps, Cybersecurity HQ, or Microsoft, notice the theme: configuration tampering or being misconfigured. No matter who the industry expert is, the attack surface is always going to be the same: tampering, misconfiguration. So how do we now, let's say, put ourselves in a better state? Again, let's address the elephant in the room. Clear separation is going to be parts of the barrier to supporting that initiative. We've kind of stated it before, but I will go back over it again. We want to reduce the admin overlap, thus improve our control within the environment. So of course, the challenge is, number one, overlap between the teams. Again, how many IT or admins do we have in the organization? Are they centralized? Are they decentralized? Again, overlap can become number one challenge. Who's accountable? Remember, if we now have multiple admins with similar rights, who actually is making the change? Do we know when another admin is making the change? That goes into accountability, thus auditing in that perspective of who moved my cheese. In this case, who changed that configuration? Why did you change that configuration? Again, change control. And then, of course, unnecessary access controls, again, overprivileged accounts. So those are the challenges that we're typically faced with. How do we solve this problem, if you will? Limit the privileges. by role or responsibility. Again, just-in-time access. Only grant the roles and the responsibilities on a limited basis when they need it, not always every day, thus increasing visibility into who can do what. It kind of goes into the scenario that while we reduce the attack surface by reducing the privileges based on each person in each role or account in each role, do we have a great way to actually report on the visibility of who has access to what? That should reduce that reporting mechanism, but again, we need to have an increased visibility into who can do what. And of course, then we need to support a more defensible audit practice. Going back to if we have fewer people with access, it supports the audit practice of least privileged access and auditability and reporting capabilities here. So again, just a clear way of looking at the challenge and the resolution. All right. So effective approaches to supporting this model. Again, scoped administration. A part of that can be challenging based off of your organizational structure, but we kind of recommend trying to scope out your administration perspective and thus segment that delineation by your agencies, your regions, or departments. We know that that's hard in today's world, but again, this is where core view comes into play. We want to talk about that, and we want to try and give you a better way to support that through segmentation of whatever that looks like in your organization. Again, agency, region, department, and or function. All right. So let's move on to the next piece here, because when I mentioned about core view, I want to kind of give you the way we look at this in our 5 pillars, if you will, for tenant resilience or tenant and operational resilience. So anticipate, withstand, recover. So in our 5 pillars, we want to start with hardening the environment. I'm pretty sure through all of the notifications, reports, the articles online, you'll see a common theme here when it comes to cyber resilience. We want to help you harden your environment. Well, how do you harden? That's probably the question. Well, you can think of what you think is important, but let's go with the standard. Number one, we want to talk about aligning those configurations to a standard. In this case, let's talk about the Center of Internet Security, the CIS controls. Align and harden your environment with those configurations, because there may be recommendations that you don't have in your environment that they are recommending. You may be misaligned by having a configuration that is recommended, but how secure are you? Again, harden the environment. Align those configurations across your tenants. Again, we talked about multi-tenant management. Ensure that you're actually adhering to the same security protocols, no matter which tenant you guys are managing, and thus detect your high risk access points as we spoke about previously. Drift detection, configuration drift. Detect the tampering or the configuration drift. We're not saying that every time there's drift, that's a tampering scenario, but again, at least be aware when things change. One of the tenants that I manage, I actually just noticed this morning, there was change in the environment that I know that I didn't make, but I noticed it happened across 2 of the tenants that I manage, the same setting changes. Hint, hint, Microsoft makes changes behind the scenes that a lot of times not noticed, but of course, I have a way to actually identify that, detect the tampering across those different policies, detect the threats, and of course, monitor or detect any of those enterprise applications. Because again, as we noted earlier, the bad actors will attack not only the accounts, but once they get in, the actual enterprise applications with the actual rights to be able to read and write to your environment. Third pillar, restore those configurations. Once we know what we know, let's harden the environment, put the perfect conditions in place, monitor for any change to those conditions. Now put us in a better position so that if change were happening, or if someone makes a mistake, believe me, I've seen that story too. Some admin went in, made a change to a conditional access policy and caused tons of disruption in the organization. Accidents can happen, not always through the bad actors, but how quickly can we recognize that and restore those configurations? So back up and restore those critical 365 configurations. Again, not in days, minutes is best. And that kind of goes back into that. Do you have a way to restore those configurations verbatim without having to reinvent the wheel? Fourth pillar, secure the tenant administration perspective. Again, talked about it as well. We could talk about it in different scenarios. Least privilege, zero trust. At the end of the day, it's about the same thing. Least privilege access for those admin accounts, just in time access. The other portion of that, if possible, segment the tenant management. Make sure that only people are managing the areas that they need to manage and not because of the way Microsoft's tenant structure is, having access to 100% of the data model to perform their actions. Only manage what they need to manage or the data point or objects that they need to manage. Delegate just enough access, again, as we mentioned before. And of course, when necessary, remove any of those overprivileged access accounts entirely. It's amazing to actually see when I get engaged with customers how many accounts actually are overprivileged or how many out there actually just have admin rights in general. So again, let's secure the tenant administration piece. And then of course, the fifth pillar, build upon that from an operational perspective. Now that we know what we know, now that we harden the environment, now that we reduce that administrative footprint, govern the environment. Remember the water. Notice we're talking primarily about the glass. Let's make sure, again, we have a barrier to ingress and egress within the application, if you will, but we also need to protect the content within. 365 governance, simplify the management of that environment, automate many of those processes, and of course, this reduces your troubleshooting scenario. So again, when you put these pillars in place, you can anticipate, withstand, and recover. And of course, as you can see here, recommended by Microsoft. All right, so hopefully this paints a great picture for you guys on how we could talk about those hidden gaps for tenant resilience with 365. What I want to do is now move to some of the use cases that CoreView has helped some of our customers with in solving these challenges or problems. Not to toot our own horn, however, I would want to just talk in general about operational outcomes and return on investment. You know, a lot of times this is a nice to have, but can we validate and justify leveraging putting some of these pillars in place? Well, as a quick example, you know, we have helped a Fortune 500 customer save $2.6 million using the CoreView technology for license optimization. So the actual cost savings pays for itself because now we're reducing that administrative footprint, if you will, having more exposure to the data model in a single interface, if you will, and now putting operational efficiencies through automation of a lot of the standard day-to-day tasks that have to happen. You can actually reduce that workload by 28%. And of course, depending upon the organizational structure and how we in IT receive and resolve those individual, let's say, tickets, if you will, again, an 85% decrease in support ticket resolution when organizations leverage CoreView technology. So again, at a bigger scale, I want you to understand that there is truly a return on investment using the technology that we're speaking about here. But now, one of the two use cases that I will highlight here. State of Florida. It is public information, so again, we just want you to be aware. State of Florida, they actually leverage the CoreView technology. I will kind of read it off just to kind of summarize what we're looking at here. They operated under a single tenant, so one tenant, but they had, again, many administrators or what's called a global admin, which of course caused or created a security and compliance risk. There was no way for them to secure and back up those tenant configurations that we spoke about. So how did CoreView help solve the problem? Well, because of that single tenant scenario, remember we used the term segmentation? Well, we have a concept called a virtual tenant. Take that entire tenant and separate, again, those objects within. Only allow those administrators, based on, in this case, their agencies, so IT can now have dedicated admins using CoreView to only manage their agency data pool of users and content, providing them, of course, with autonomy while maintaining control and compliance. reducing the amount of overprivileged accounts. Because going through CoreView, we can reduce a lot of the administrative controls on the back end on 365 and grant them specific custom permissions to perform the tasks that they need in the virtual tenant through the CoreView UI. Then for the configuration backup configurations, CoreView's configuration management capabilities allow the state of Florida to back up the tenant configurations, minimizing the impact of breach. Again, we talked about the data backups. Many vendors out there support backing up your email, your files, your SharePoint sites, infrastructure, things of that nature. Rarely is it possible to back up those configurations. And again, with a large state agency like the state of Florida, with many admins making change if necessary, they needed a great way to, again, standardize on being able to back up and quickly recover misconfigurations when and if necessary. And the last use case that I will speak about is the state of Florida. Oh, excuse me, Iowa. So their challenge was multi-tenant management. At the time, they had 9 separate 365 tenants and lots of shadow IT when it came down to some of those additional apps across the environment there. So think about an IT staff now having to manage 9 individual tenants, separate access identity points, separate configurations across the board. That was a challenge. They needed to, again, standardize on the created several operational and security challenges around the visibility. That means that they would actually have to log in and out across multiple browsers in different sessions to try and be able to manage and maintain each and every one of those tenants. Well, CoreView gives you essentially that single pane of glass, provides multi-tenant management all in one fell swoop to manage 365. Think about the reporting mechanisms. I'm pretty sure people here on this call have had to go build some type of report. How many shared mailboxes do we have? How many mailboxes have external mail forwarding enabled? Things of that nature. Well, instead of doing a lot of PowerShell scripting, imports, exports of data to try and AI it together, within minutes, they could turn around and build those reports and gather that information versus hours and external access points. And of course, we talked about the app registrations when it came down to the shadow IT. We know that they need to deploy additional apps, but they could now proactively monitor the app registration perspective. How many apps do they have out there? What rights or permissions do those apps have? Are they owned? So when you talk about the lifecycle management of an app, many apps, depending upon the situation, have secrets and certificates. Are you monitoring when those expire? I was actually on a call with a customer just a few days ago, and we did what we call a health check. One of the things that I noticed was they actually had an application. The title of the application has something to do with finance, so I think that's a pretty important application, but the certificate was going to expire in less than 30 days. If no one's monitoring that scenario, think about how disruptive it is when that app is now broken. The end users are actually going to say, I can't get in, the application is not working. Well, if you don't know how to quickly troubleshoot, you could spend more hours trying to figure out why the application is broken or not functioning, when it could be something as simple as an expired secret or a certificate that could have been mitigated weeks earlier. So hopefully you see a little bit of value in what CoreView can bring to the table. You've identified some of those gaps within the resilience of your 365 environments, and it brings more knowledge to you guys to be able to support your state agencies. Just as one ending component here, as I've alluded to, we can help you back up and restore those tenant configuration settings that we've been talking about or speaking about. But when you also look at some of those use cases, like for the state of Iowa and the state of Florida, CoreView can do and support many of those workloads. I just wanted you to kind of understand that CoreView's technology is broad and sparse, and so we just wanted to kind of leave you with these are some different ways and mechanisms of supporting your environment through the CoreView technology. Thank you for your time, and if there are any questions, I will attempt to answer those in short order here. I do see that there was one. Do you offer an assessment service? If so, please share details of what it includes. Essentially, what we would do is, again, when we speak with one of our account executives, essentially I would call that what we would dub as a health check. Essentially, as I just mentioned before, we would get connected, our technology connected with your tenant, and we have pre-built governance policies. Back to the governance term, the governance policies to basically give you a health score. That score is based off of how your water is configured. How are you managing your data points? For an example, do you know how many SharePoint sites may have anonymous sharing? I mentioned about external mail forwarding. Are you quickly able to look at that information? So these are pre-built reports that by day one, when we get connected, we'll be able to provide that health check, if you will, for your environment. If necessary, from a configuration perspective, we can also connect and based on that initial assessment of the backup of your configurations, report on where you are or are not aligned with the CIS controls. Because we standardize using the CIS controls as the baseline configuration to help you understand where you may have deviated. If there are no other questions, I do thank you for your time.
Thank you everyone for joining today. And you'll get an email shortly with the recording. Have a great rest of your day.